This anime series begins by showing the great battle that took place on October 21, 1600, which brought together the Eastern Army, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, against the Western Army led by Ishida Mitsunari, which the battle would later be known as the Battle of Sekigahara in history. During the war, Masanori Fukushima, the commander of the Eastern Army, looks confused when he sees the soldiers' fighting spirit, which seems endless, even though the Eastern Army has managed to corner them in battle. Slowly but surely, the Western Army turned out to be able to turn things around, so Masanori and the soldiers from the Eastern Army immediately became overwhelmed in the face of the onslaught of attacks. On the other hand, Shimazu Toyohisa, the commander of the Western armies, had known that Naomasa and his army were heading toward them to fight. Because of that, Toyohisa asked his uncle, Shimazu Yoshihiro, to hurry away from the battlefield with his guards and let himself lead the Western army to face Naomasa and his army. Toyohisa made this decision not solely without reason, because he knew that the key to their victory was if Yoshihiro managed to return safely to Satsuma. Even though there was a debate between the two of them, Yoshihiro finally complied with his nephew's wishes because there really was no other choice. Shortly after Yoshihiro and his guards left the battlefield, the cavalry led by Naomasa approached so fast where Toyohisa and his troops were currently. The thick fog and rumbling sounds that sounded from a distance indicated that the number of these troops was far more than the Western army led by Toyohisa. However, Toyohisa didn't look the least bit daunted, and his expression looked calm and so confident about the upcoming battle as if he could confirm that victory was within his grasp. When Naomasa and his army were in sight, Toyohisa ordered his soldiers to fire at the enemy troops. However, the Western army immediately became desperate because, besides being outnumbered, Naomasa ordered his men to directly slaughter the Western army while they prepared their firearms for their next attack. On the other hand, Toyohisa's fighting spirit did not waver, and he stood firm against the enemy, even though his army had been defeated. By swinging his sword, he then rushed toward Naomasa. Seeing the enemy approaching their general, Naomasa's guards did not stay silent and rushed to protect him while trying to face Toyohisa, who was preparing to attack them. Thinking that Toyohisa would surrender because they were outnumbered, Naomasa and his army looked shocked when they saw him desperately breaking through their defenses regardless of the dozens of spears that stabbed into his body. Unexpectedly, Toyohisa turned out to have devised a strategy in such a way that he could approach the general of the Eastern Army and immediately fired a shot at Naomasa, which hit him in the chest. Seeing that their leader was badly injured by Toyohisa's gunfire, the Eastern Army decided to withdraw from the battlefield, leaving him, who could still stand upright despite being seriously injured. With severe injuries all over his body, Toyohisa tried to get up and return to Satsuma. Even though he couldn't reach his destination safely, he continued to swing his steps through the forest in the darkness. As he walks from the battlefield bleeding, Toyohisa finds himself transported to a corridor of doors, where a bespectacled man named Murasaki at a desk waits for him. Seeing his arrival, Murasaki folded the newspaper he was reading, took several sheets of paper bearing his name, and then wrote something on the paper. Because the bespectacled man in front of him didn't say anything, Toyohisa tried to attack him because he thought the man was his enemy. But then, Toyohisa was suddenly sucked into one of the doors and dropped into a field, unconscious. After that, two elven boys were seen approaching him. The two elven boys are Marcia and Mark, a pair of brothers who live in a village not far from the forest where he is currently located. They looked surprised to see him lying unconscious with wounds all over his body. However, after seeing Toyohisa's appearance, the siblings knew he was not from their world. Marcia and Mark then talk about drifters and assume that he is a drifter who came to their world. At the same time, Toyohisa finally came to his senses, but his body still felt so weak that he could not stand up. Because he seems to be badly injured, they decide to take him to a castle ruin, which is the hiding place of the drifters, as strangers like him come into their world. The two brothers looked overwhelmed to support Toyohisa's body, which was bigger than theirs. Even so, they continued to advance towards their destination to save him because his safety would be threatened if he was left alone in the forest. In fact, they were afraid of dealing with the drifters like Toyohisa. Apart from being strangers who are not from their world, Marcia and Mark are threatened with punishment from the Knights of the Orde Empire, who have ordered them to avoid direct contact with the drifters. Even so, they sympathize with him and decide to help him. Before reaching the castle ruins not far in front of them, Marcia and Mark suddenly stopped when a drifter ordered them not to go further. The drifter then readied his bow and was about to shoot the two brothers when they tried to explain that they only wanted to take a man who was injured. But the difference in language makes it difficult for them to understand each other, so almost a dispute arises. Realizing the sincerity of the two elven boys who only intended to help the man, the drifter finally lowered his weapon and told Marcia and Mark to leave the place immediately. After that, the archer drifter met his comrade who was in the castle ruins and told him about two nearby villagers who had delivered another drifter who had just arrived seriously injured. Knowing that Toyohisa was wearing clothes bearing the symbol of a clan originating from Japan, the drifter who was in the castle immediately ordered him to bring him in and treat his wounds. Long story short, after his wounds were treated, Toyohisa finally came to his senses and seemed very surprised by the situation around him. As a very experienced soldier on the battlefield, he reflexively drew his sword and tried to attack the man sitting in front of him, who had been watching him for a long time. Unexpectedly, the man could dodge his attack until finally, he stopped attacking when he finally found out that the man standing in front of him right now was Oda Nobunaga, a famous warlord. He conquered most of Japan during the Sengoku period. Even though Nobunaga told the truth, Toyohisa didn't believe his words at all because, according to his knowledge, Oda Nobunaga had long been dead. The three of them then engage in conversation as fellow drifters. Toyohisa finally realizes that there is a significant time difference between their world and the other world where they are currently. He revealed that Oda Nobunaga had been declared dead 18 years ago, while Nobunaga claimed that he had not even been in that place for a year. Hearing Nobunaga's confession, Toyohisa became even more curious about what really happened to them. After that, he asked about the archer drifter's identity, who introduced himself as Nasu Sukataka Yoichi. Although Yoichi looks very young because he is only 19 years old, in reality, he had lived hundreds of years before Nobunaga and Toyohisa because he turned out to be a powerful warrior involved in the Genpei War that took place in the 1180s. Toyohisa reveals his true identity as belonging to the Shimazu clan and talks about the bespectacled man he met in a long hallway before he was suddenly sucked into a door and ended up in the world they are currently in. Hearing this, Nobunaga and Yoichi also revealed that they had also experienced the same thing before coming to this world and then wondered about who the mysterious bespectacled man really was and his purpose in sending them to this world. Knowing that Toyohisa came from an era that was not much different from his time, Nobunaga then asked about his eldest son, Oda Nobutada. Toyohisa reluctantly explains that Nobutada was ultimately defeated by Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga was silent when he heard the tragic fate of his beloved son. However, it was clear on his face that Nobunaga was trying to contain the anger and sadness in his heart. Meanwhile, outside the castle ruins, a woman named Almanu secretly spied on the three of them. She reported her observations to her leader, who was elsewhere via a crystal ball. Knowing about the emergence of a new drifter, the leader then asked Almanu to carry out their plan because the Black King had prepared his troops to wipe out all mankind from the face of this earth. Elsewhere, her comrade, a young man named Ham, appears to be keeping an eye on two other drifters embroiled in a bitter feud. Ham, who also received the same order from the leader, was finally forced to intervene to stop the dispute between the two drifters. Meanwhile, Marcia and Mark seemed to be severely scolded by their older brother, Shara, because they had helped the drifter, even though they already knew the heavy punishment they would receive if their actions were discovered by the Knights of the Orde Empire, who had made it forbidden for the residents to approach the drifters, which they considered a threat. Even though Marcia and Mark carried out the rescue action secretly, the Empire seemed to have found out about their actions and sent one of the knights named Aram to lead the troops and attack the village where they lived as punishment for both of them for violating the rules. At the same time, Toyohisa and the drifters immediately realized a war was happening in the elves' residential area. They suspected the masterminds behind the attack were bandits who wanted to control the village. Furthermore, Nobunaga said that the two brothers who had saved Toyohisa were the elves who came from a village not far from where they are now. Upon hearing that, Toyohisa rushed to the village where Marcia and Mark lived, ignoring the condition of his body which had not fully recovered after the Battle of Sekigahara. Toyohisa doesn't care about his health because he can't let injustice and oppression happen before his eyes whenever and wherever he is. Seeing Toyohisa, who was so confident and determined to uphold justice, Nobunaga and Yoichi became excited to follow him and fight with him in the war. Almanu, who saw their movement towards the battlefield, immediately reported this to their leader. On the way to the village, Toyohisa and the drifters met Marcia and Mark, who were trying to save themselves and tried to ask the drifters for help. Nobunaga immediately fired shots at the people chasing the two boys and Toyohisa, who swung his sword and slashed them all. Marcia and Mark looked very surprised because the man they had saved was surprisingly tough and could trounce the Imperial soldiers. After defeating several of them, Nobunaga finally learned that the people who had attacked the village were not bandits but the Imperial troops led by a knight. Instead of being afraid, Nobunaga was even more excited because he had not acted in a long time on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in the burnt and ravaged village, Aram gathers the villagers, who are elves. He says they all deserve the severest punishment for daring to violate the Empire's regulations, which strictly forbid the elves from getting involved with the drifters. The village leader then tried to explain to Aram that they were only trying to save the life of a dying man. The young elf man bravely asked Aram to stop treating his people arbitrarily. Their lives became very miserable after the greedy and arrogant nobles ran the government as they pleased. Aram didn't even hesitate to show that the elves were completely worthless in his eyes by killing the village leader right in front of them. The cruelty of Aram and his soldiers continued to slaughter the villagers indiscriminately, whether they were adults or children. Shortly after, a soldier approached Aram and frantically reported to him that all the wheat fields around the village had been devoured by fire. He rushed to the site of the fire and was very surprised to see the wheat fields that had been the gold mines of the nobles had turned into a sea of fire. He thought about trying to put out the fire along with his soldiers, but with the flames spreading throughout the area, then it was certain that they would not be able to extinguish it in a short time. The mastermind behind the fire is none other than Nobunaga, whose aim is to avenge Aram and the nobles, who often act arbitrarily against the elves and make it easier for them to take power from the greedy and arrogant nobles. At the same time, Aram and his warriors are shocked by the appearance of someone amid the flames, none other than Toyohisa, who is ready to slay them all with his sword. With his experience on the battlefield as well as his extremely formidable fighting ability, Toyohisa could easily slay the soldiers of the Empire. Aram found out that Toyohisa was a drifter because of his clothes and the language difference that made it difficult for them to communicate. Marcia and Mark decided to return to the village with Toyohisa and told their older brother that he had saved them both and would fight for the elves. After that, Aram and Toyohisa immediately engage in a fierce one-on-one duel, where he looks so angry that Aram and his army have massacred the weak and helpless villagers. Toyohisa then threw his sword at him and ran as fast as he could until he finally managed to knock Aram down. After that, Toyohisa locks Aram's movement beneath him and beats Aram heavily with his scabbard. The elves looked wide-eyed in shock when they saw that one of the most formidable knights in the Orde Empire could easily be defeated by a drifter who had just arrived in their world. While Toyohisa beats Aram to a pulp, Yoichi appears to shoot his arrows at the remaining soldiers trying to escape from there and kill them. After confirming that Aram would no longer be able to rise to fight, Toyohisa then asked the elves to take their revenge on him by killing him. At first, the elves refused Toyohisa's request because they feared it would cause even bigger problems. However, Toyohisa persisted in convincing the elves to avenge the deaths of the villagers who had been massacred by Aram and his army. Even though the elves didn't really understand his words, they finally realized that they had to have the courage to put up a fight to stop the nobles' oppression of the elves. Full of anger, the elves took the weapons lying near them and brutally killed Aram. The killing of Aram was also intended as a form of resistance to the cruelty of the nobles who always oppressed the elves. From now on, they will not stand by and will fight with all their might to protect what is important to them. Seeing the courage and determination possessed by the elves, Toyohisa was a little relieved because he could help them understand the importance of fighting for their own lives from oppression in any form. After that incident, the elves finally realized that the drifters had very great power, which also explains why Aram and the nobles forbade the elves to interact with the drifters, which could potentially be a difficult threat to deal with if they succeeded in leading the elves into resistance against the nobles as well as the empire. News of the success of Toyohisa and the drifters defeating Aram and his army was immediately known to Murasaki, who was in his place. Not long after, a woman named Easy appeared from the opposite direction, where her appearance then enveloped the place with an aura of darkness. Easy tells Murasaki that the drifters sent by him to this world will not be able to last much longer because the victory will be on her side. Murasaki didn't seem to pay much attention to Easy's words and insisted that he would not let her achieve her goal, then kicked her out of there. Easy, who heard his words, suddenly felt irritated, and with her power, she changed the news about Toyohisa's success with news about the Black King who had launched an attack in the south. After that, Easy emphasized to Murasaki that the drifters would not be able to defeat her subordinates, known as the Ends. Upon learning that, he does not deny that the Ends are a formidable opponent for the drifters because, like the drifters, the Ends are the powerful historical figures brought into this world. Meanwhile, Almanu, who turned out to be part of the Octobrist organization, a group of human magicians native to the world whose duty is to observe and gather the drifters together to fight the Black King, then reported about Toyohisa and the drifters. They managed to defeat Aram and his army and formed an alliance with the elves. Upon hearing that, the leader of the Octobrist, Seimei, rushed to meet Ham, who had succeeded in persuading two old men who were the drifters. They were Scipio Africanus and Hannibal Barca, who were involved in a fierce dispute before Ham finally reconciled the two and persuaded them to go with him. Knowing that the Black King had launched an attack on the southern region, Seimei and Ham rushed towards the kingdom of Carneades, where they tried to convince the commander of defensive troops to let Scipio and Hannibal take charge of their army. However, the leaders refused to give the two drifters command over their troops, seeing them as nothing more than useless old men. Unable to reason with the Carneades soldiers, Seimei decides to withdraw the Octobrist and the drifters from the country because the Black King and his army will soon arrive at the kingdom of Carneades. Knowing that they would have a hard time fighting the Black King without the help of the drifters, Seimei didn't want to risk forcing the Octobrist to keep fighting without a proper commando who could lead them in battle. However, before Seimei and the Octobrist had left the place, the Black King and his army had already arrived in the kingdom of Carneades. Seeing the Black King's army, which was far more numerous than they expected, the commanders of Carneades' army immediately became frightened, especially when the Black King launched an attack on the defensive fort. To speed up the movement of his troops to occupy the fortress of the kingdom of Carneades, the Black King then ordered the Ends, which consisted of Hijikata Toshizo, Jeanne d'Arc, and Anastasia Romanov, who were powerful historical figures whose combat abilities could not be underestimated. Apart from the three of them, the Black King also had an army of non-human races and a herd of dragons who launched attacks from the air. With such a formidable fighting power and almost no gaps to be defeated, the Black King and his army could easily master the battle, and it was only a matter of time before they would occupy the kingdom of Carneades, which ruled the north. Suddenly, a connecting door between dimensions appeared during the ongoing war that hovered above the battlefield. Until then, the door opened and brought a fighter plane from the World War II era. Seimei, as well as the Ends, who witnessed the appearance of the fighter plane, immediately found out that the pilot driving the fighter was the drifter who was sent to this world. The pilot of the fighter plane was Naoshi Kano, who died in World War II in 1945. At first, he was confused by the circumstances around him and the fierce battle that was taking place below him. He flew his plane around the area to find out what really happened and where he was at this time. At the same time, Hijikata managed to break through the defenses of the Carneades soldiers who tried to block him, destroying one of the entrances in the fort. When Hijikata walked into the fortress, they could feel a huge killing aura from within him, which indicated that he was not an ordinary person because, with his aura alone, he could make others tremble and choose not to face him. Meanwhile, Jeanne d'Arc seemed dissatisfied with just slaughtering the Carneades soldiers because she used her ability to manipulate fire and then burn the soldiers. On the other hand, Anastasia, who always seems emotionless, has quite a terrible power because of her supernatural ability to create blizzards, where she does not hesitate to freeze the Carneades soldiers who try to attack her. Shortly afterward, the fort was finally fully controlled by the Black King and his army, where the Black King immediately ordered his army to massacre all soldiers, even the residents of the kingdom of Carneades they encountered, whether women or children. Naoshi, who watched the massacre from a distance, does not just stand still and rush to help them. The scene then switches and shows two drifters looking anxiously awaiting the arrival of Seimei and the Octobrist, where previously they had planned to leave the kingdom of Carneades as soon as possible. Not long after, Seimei and Ham finally came with Scipio and Hannibal and then asked the two drifters to quickly take them away from there in a horse-drawn carriage. Before leaving, Seimei asked the drifters to stay afloat no matter what because their next mission was to find Toyohisa and his comrades and convince them to work together against the Black King and his army. Because by gathering the drifters, they will have a commensurate strength to match the Ends under the orders of the Black King. On the way, several soldiers from the Black King's army confronted Seimei and the drifters. One of the drifters, a man nicknamed the Sundance Kid, then uses a Gatling gun to ward off attacks from the Black King's troops. After successfully defeating the Black King's army that was chasing them, Seimei and the drifters were surprised by the appearance of a dragon about to attack them. At the same time, Naoshi arrived and immediately attacked the dragon with consecutive shots fired from his fighter plane, indicating that Naoshi had sided with the drifters. After confirming that Seimei and the drifters had left the fort safely, Naoshi returned to the battlefield, tried to defeat the dragons attacking the fort from the air, and immediately attacked the dragon with consecutive shots fired from his fighter plane. Meanwhile, seeing the fortress belonging to the kingdom of Carneades behind him that had been destroyed and controlled by the Black King, Seimei promised he would not let something similar happen anywhere else and was determined to defeat the Black King and his army in the upcoming battle. On the other hand, the Black King was not necessarily satisfied despite having won the battle and mastered the fort. He ordered the Ends to find the drifters and kill them and everyone who fought alongside them without exception. The news of the Black King's victory in battle and successfully occupying the fortress in the north then made Easy even more arrogant in front of Murasaki. Easy feels very confident that the drifters sent by Murasaki to this world will not be able to defeat the Ends and stop the Black King from realizing his desire to rule the world. However, Murasaki completely ignored her words, which he thought were too quick to assume, because the real battle had not yet started.
紫
Elsewhere, Almanu, who was assigned to spy on Toyohisa and his comrades, was finally caught and interrogated by them because they thought that she was a spy for the nobles. Almanu denied the accusations and revealed that she's part of the Octobrist organization, whose duty is to observe and gather the drifters like them. She informs the drifters that they have been brought to the New World to fight against the Ents and the Black King, who intend to destroy the world. Furthermore, Almanu explained that the Ents are actually powerful historical figures who were selected and sent to this world with a different purpose from the drifters. She says that the Octobrist organization's goal is to gather the drifters from all over the country and make sure they form an alliance to work together against the Black King and his army, including the Ents, who are his most powerful warriors. Upon learning that, Nobunaga then asked Almanu about the number of troops owned by the Octobrist and the alliance troops. Since she could not answer the question in detail, Nobunaga then said that they would not be able to win the battle, even with the help of the drifters, because basically, the number of troops would more or less affect their strength on the battlefield. Almanu, who didn't want to lose Nobunaga's trust, told him that the Octobrist was trying to form an alliance with the Orde Empire and the nobles. However, her words made Nobunaga laugh because he felt very sure they would not be willing to form an alliance and risk their lives under the command of strangers like the drifters, who don't even belong to this world. Hearing this, Almanu did not deny that Nobunaga's words were true. Knowing that he seems to have the ability to formulate an effective strategy, she asks him for advice on the steps they should take to form an alliance to defeat the Black King. Nobunaga suggested that they take power from the nobles first, where the military aggression would be led directly by Toyohisa. The Octobrist or other parties, including the drifters, who wish to form an alliance with the three, must accept Toyohisa as their leader and be willing to follow all his orders. Almanu seemed very surprised to hear Nobunaga's words, and Toyohisa, who had been silent since then, listened to their conversation with great attention. He seemed annoyed that Nobunaga had arbitrarily appointed him as the leader, and they soon got into an argument. Seeing Toyohisa's undaunted attitude in dealing with any situation, Almanu thought it would not hurt them to try following Nobunaga's advice. Meanwhile, the Black King, who had controlled the fortifications of the northern region, was seen checking the condition of his soldiers who were injured in battle after receiving a report from one of the Ents, namely Grigory Rasputin. Surprisingly, the Black King has healing powers that can treat any disease and wound that seems impossible to heal. With this power, the Black King then healed all his wounded soldiers so that they could return to fight in the next battle. After that, the Black King ordered Rasputin to spread the victory of those who managed to occupy the fortress of the northern region and invite all races and nations that hate humans to join them and exterminate humanity from this world. In addition, the Black King also insists on the Ents to find the drifters as soon as possible and kill them before they unite their forces and form an alliance to fight against them. On the other hand, Naoshi seems to have difficulty flying his fighter plane because the plane was damaged in his battle against a herd of dragons. That's why Naoshi was forced to land his fighter plane in the middle of the wilderness. The noise caused by Naoshi when landing the plane attracted the attention of a group of mysterious creatures that inhabit the forest where he is currently. Instead of feeling afraid, he challenged the creatures to leave their hiding places and directly face them. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the elves were seen holding a meeting to discuss their next steps because sooner or later, the nobles would surely send troops to attack the village and slaughter them after they assassinated Aram. After a long discussion, the elves finally agreed to carry out a rebellion and form an alliance with the drifters who had helped them before. The scene then switches and shows Almanu, who then gives an amulet to Toyohisa and his comrades so that they can understand the language used by the inhabitants of that world. Nobunaga became even more curious about the figure of the leader of the Octobrist after seeing the amulet because it looked exactly like the amulet usually written by the Onmyoji from Kyoto. After that, Almanu told about the history of the elves being one of the demi-human race who were the original inhabitants of that world, where they lived in peace until 50 years ago they were defeated by the Orde Empire in a war. After that, the elves were forced to always submit and obey and were often treated arbitrarily. Hearing a piece of history about the elves, Nobunaga intends to attract their sympathy by offering revenge against the Orde Empire, who had colonized their place of residence and treated them as slaves for years. Nobunaga then asked Toyohisa to give a speech to increase the fighting spirit of the elves to rebel against the Orde Empire because, according to Nobunaga, Toyohisa has both strength and charisma as a good leader. Upon hearing that, Toyohisa then said that he would do his job, not against Nobunaga's wish, but because he couldn't allow the oppression of the weak to happen before his eyes. Full of confidence, Toyohisa began to give speeches in front of the elves, who seemed to show admiration for him, who supported and encouraged them to fight for a better and more decent life in the future so that they would no longer be victims of oppression from those who wanted to exploit the elves. Shara, the older brother of Marcia and Mark, reveals that he is the son of the village leader who was killed by Aram and asks Toyohisa and the drifters to help him. The other villagers must defeat the Orde Empire's troops, who are expected to invade their village in the next few days. However, Shara reveals that the elves do not have any skills in combat, while what they will face is the Orde Empire, which is notorious for being cruel and thirsty for power, where they do not hesitate to slaughter the demi-human races because they think humans are far superior to them in every way. Knowing this, Nobunaga thought that their chances of conquering the Orde Empire would be even greater because they would take advantage of the hatred of the elves and the other demi-human races and convince them to rebel against the oppression and cruelty they had endured during their lifetime. In the following days, the Orde Empire's army of 200 people was seen heading to the elf settlement to carry out a large-scale massacre of the elves who had killed Aram and his army. They apparently also knew about the elves who had formed an alliance with the drifters. However, the soldiers didn't seem too worried about it and felt confident they could complete the mission in no time. After traveling quite a distance from the capital, the soldiers of the Orde Empire finally arrived at the elves settlement. However, how shocked they were when they found out that the village had been abandoned by the elves. Although in reality, it is part of the war strategy that has been planned by Toyohisa and the drifters so that they can win the battle. The soldiers from the Orde Empire then rushed to find the whereabouts of the elves throughout the village, but the search effort failed because they found no sign of life in the village, as if the elves had indeed left the village where they had been living. Not only that, but they also found that the only well used as a source of clean water in the village had been polluted with dirt, so anyone who decided to stay in that place, even if only temporarily, would not get a clean water source. Meanwhile, up in the trees, Toyohisa and the elves were seen watching the movements of the Orde Empire soldiers below them, who planned to attack the troops at nightfall. The scene then switches to a few days earlier, where Toyohisa and the drifters are providing the elves with brief martial arts training and teaching them to use weapons such as swords, spears, and arrows, which they had previously gathered from the battle against Aram and his army. In addition, Nobunaga also ordered the elves to dispose of the bodies of Aram and his army in a large enough field, not to bury them. Although impressed as a cruel act, it is part of Nobunaga's war strategy because human bodies can produce certain substances that can be used as explosives if mixed with loose soil. Seeing how Nobunaga and Toyohisa devised a war strategy, Almanu immediately realized the big difference between civilians like herself and the drifters, who were tough fighters with different views on life and death. Nobunaga asked Almanu to inform the Octobrist about the war and asked them to send sulfur powder immediately. However, Nobunaga did not explain why he needed the sulfur powder. On the other hand, Yoichi is seen teaching the elves archery techniques and seems impressed that the elves can master archery techniques in a short time. One of the elves then tells Yoichi that the elves are actually natural-born archers. However, their archery skills are slowly fading because since being defeated by the Orde Empire, the elves are not allowed to wield any weapons at all. To motivate the elves, Yoichi then showed his archery skills, which immediately made them full of admiration because none of the arrows fired by Yoichi missed the target. After completing their training, Toyohisa gathered the elves, explaining the strategy they would use to win the battle against the Orde Empire's troops. Toyohisa also reminded the elves of the importance of fighting for their independence so they would no longer be treated as slaves. He informed that the battle against 200 soldiers of the Orde Empire was only the beginning of their military aggression because then they would carry out a more massive movement until peace was restored in the country. His words motivated the elves to take revenge for all the oppression and humiliation they had experienced so far and all the pent-up anger they would vent into the battle that would soon take place that night. Turning to the present, when the sun finally set and the day turned into night, Toyohisa led the elves to attack the Orde Empire soldiers camped in the village. With a fiery fighting spirit, he led the elves on the battlefield and knocked out one by one the soldiers who were on guard, then continued the attack by eliminating them from one tent to another. The screams of pain from the soldiers immediately broke the silence of the night. The soldiers of the Orde Empire finally realized that they were being attacked by the elves, who were supposed to be the targets of their massacre. Under the strategy they had planned, Toyohisa led the imperial soldiers into the trap they had prepared. Meanwhile, Nobunaga and the elven army he led had prepared to carry out their duties as planned at the designated location. The moment reminded him of the past when he led an army of 200,000 people from the Oda clan. Even though currently only leading a group of inexperienced elves to fight on a battlefield that was ordinary to him, Nobunaga still had a fiery fighting spirit to defeat the enemy on the battlefield. He ordered the elves to shoot fire arrows toward their village, and immediately, the flames devoured the settlement. The fire was meant to surround the soldiers who were still there, where they were forced to come face to face with Nobunaga, who was waiting for them at the end of the exit. With a smirk on his face, Nobunaga greeted his enemies with joy. When the soldiers were within firing range, the elves immediately shot their arrows and slaughtered the enemy troops who tried to attack them. Judging from their fighting style, he knew that the troops sent by the Oda Empire were lower-level soldiers who were less experienced on the battlefield, so they could easily be defeated by them. After that, Nobunaga intended to target the commander of the army, because if the leader has been defeated, the troops will lose their fighting spirit and choose to surrender. He ordered the elves to shoot arrows that had been smeared with dirt, where they could leave scars infected by bacteria due to the absence of clean water to clean the wound. And if left like that, the soldiers would slowly die from the bacterial infection of the wounds. They were also increasingly cornered by Toyohisa, who arrived after slaughtering their comrades. However, as Nobunaga predicted earlier, Toyohisa finished the commander so that the war would end without having to put in more energy and time. With lightning speed, Toyohisa broke through the soldiers' barricades and swung his sword to kill the commander. Seeing their leader defeated, the soldiers panicked and lost their fighting spirit. On the other hand, Nobunaga seems satisfied with Toyohisa's success and is increasingly convinced that he can become a great leader on the battlefield because this leadership character has been passed down from generation to generation in the Toyohisa family. Meanwhile, the surviving soldiers tried to escape from the battlefield but were soon intercepted by Yoichi and a squad of archers, who slaughtered them. For some reason, the battle atmosphere reminded him more or less of someone from when he was alive. After successfully winning the battle, Toyohisa and his comrades will continue their march towards the nearest military base belonging to the nobles of the Oda Empire. Meanwhile, military officials looked worried at the headquarters because they had lost Aram and his army, who were tough soldiers. Moreover, the troops they sent to the elf settlements had not returned yet. They also became increasingly worried because they did not have enough soldiers to guard the place, and if suddenly an attack occurred, they would not be able to defend the base. One of the top military officers planned to send many troops to kill the elves carrying out the rebellion. This was done to prevent rebellions in other places that could threaten the empire's sovereignty. Not long after, a soldier came to meet the military officials in his room and informed them that the troops they sent to kill the elves had returned. Upon hearing that, the military officials were relieved and assumed that the rebellion had been overcome. In fact, the troops were Nobunaga and the elves in disguise. When they finally entered the base, Nobunaga and the elves broke their disguises and arrested everyone there. The military officials could only surrender when Nobunaga and his comrades occupied the base because they also did not have the strength to put up a fight. Toyohisa, who was already angry, then asked about the whereabouts of the elven women who had been held captive by them. After receiving information about where the elven women were held captive, Toyohisa and the elves rushed to that place. However, how heartbroken the elves were when they found out about their wives' and daughters' condition, which is also very worrying because they had only been used as slaves to satisfy the desires of depraved men. Knowing this, Toyohisa immediately became angry, determined to avenge the elven women against the savage men who had ruined their lives and would not stop until they all died painfully. On the other hand, Nobunaga and the other elves were seen searching the place, hoping to find important files that might be useful to make the next step easier. In that place, Nobunaga and Almanu found a fairly large portrait painting, which showed the face of a man who, according to Almanu, was the founder of the Oda Empire, Adolf Hitler. Furthermore, she told him that the Octobrists had not been able to confirm whether Hitler sided with the Drifters or vice versa because all this time, it was the nobles who ran the government who made the rules regarding the Drifters. After that, an elf told Nobunaga that Toyohisa was about to execute the top military officers as well as the soldiers of the Oda Empire who were in the base, who were responsible for the abuse they had committed against the elven women. Nobunaga rushed there to witness how Toyohisa carried out the execution. Before the execution, the military officials begged Toyohisa to forgive them. Toyohisa flatly refused their pleas because their oppression and depravity were unforgivable at all times, and the death penalty was the most appropriate reward for all of them. However, when he was about to execute them, Nobunaga suddenly hit his head from behind, causing him to collapse unconscious. Nobunaga actually did not intend to thwart the execution. He did it solely because he didn't want Toyohisa to get his hands dirty by killing the savage soldiers. He thinks that he is the one who is more suitable to execute these savage soldiers because Toyohisa is a leader. When he was about to fire a shot, suddenly one of them raised his hand and tried to convince Nobunaga that he was not involved with all the barbaric acts carried out by the soldiers because he had just been transferred to the base. Hearing that, Nobunaga seemed slightly interested in the man, and it occurred to him to take advantage of the man for information that might facilitate their next move. Therefore, Nobunaga left the man alive while he immediately executed the others. Later, the news about the uprising of the elves, assisted by the drifters, finally spread to all corners of the country. The people also believed the news was true because the elven women held captive by the imperial soldiers had returned to their respective families. This moment was also used by Nobunaga to send a letter, inviting the elves in other areas to fight for their fate and be free from the oppression and abuse they have experienced so far. His plan turned out to be successful in moving the elves elsewhere to rebel and concentrate all their forces under the drifters' command. In a short time, rebellions broke out in many places and spread to all corners of the country. The nobles became increasingly panicked and anxious because their power was in danger of collapsing. In fact, many territories that were previously controlled by nobles and became part of the Oda Empire have now been completely taken over by their original owners, the elves. News of the uprising of the elves also reached Easy, who was suddenly irritated that the elves had formed an alliance with the drifters and built a fighting force against the Black King and the Ents. Meanwhile, defeat after defeat continued to be experienced by the Oda Empire troops, which frustrated the officials at the center of government because if they continued to swallow defeat, the Oda Empire's power would be completely destroyed soon. The war that has been going on for quite a while has drained all of its resources, strength, and strategy. However, they have not won until now. Realizing that they could not allow this situation to continue, one of the government officials then suggested that they make a peace agreement with the non-human races they had been fighting. However, other officials immediately rejected the proposal because they did not want to disappoint Adolf Hitler, who had gone to great lengths to establish the Oda Empire. While the officials had a heated argument, a noble named Count Saint Germy arrived there, and the officials fell silent for a moment because Saint Germy was one of the most influential people in the government. Not only that, a quarter of the Oda Empire's territory is in the hands of Saint Germy, so that man's words must always be listened to, and his orders must be obeyed. Saint Germy informs that the merchant guild Gubinen has attacked the imperial fleet sent to supply supplies to the west. The fleet was eventually destroyed before reaching its destination. Saint Germy then reveals that the Oda Empire will not last much longer because the wars they started have brought bad karma, especially now that their enemies had formed an alliance and concentrated their strength on counterattacking from various sides. In addition, the Oda Empire was also experiencing an internal crisis within its government. However, Saint Germy did not inform the officials of the solution to all these problems because he had his own plan to visit the elves and the drifters. They were the masterminds of the revolt that occurred throughout the country. Meanwhile, support from the elves for Toyohisa and his comrades continued to arrive from various regions, where they swore allegiance to fight on the side of Toyohisa and the drifters. However, this did not necessarily make Toyohisa feel happy because the larger the troops he led, the greater the chance of betrayal, making it difficult for the drifters in the future. He conferred with Nobunaga and Yoichi and tried to find ways to overcome their problems. Toyohisa suggested that they establish a leadership structure, but Nobunaga refused because he wanted to make Toyohisa the sole leader. Toyohisa then asserts that he doesn't care about power and just wants the great power they have amassed so far not to become a ticking time bomb for himself and the drifters. Knowing that he could not persuade Toyohisa if he had a strong will, Nobunaga finally agreed to his request. Even in his heart, he still intends to make Toyohisa the sole leader. After that, the elves who had just joined took training from Toyohisa and the drifters to develop their respective abilities and talents. Nobunaga asked Shara to find a talented blacksmith who could make many replica firearms. Shara tells Nobunaga that the dwarves are the most reliable blacksmiths in the world, and only they can make such replicas. Elsewhere, Yoichi is seen teaching the young elves archery techniques. Yoichi seems serious about training them because he wants the young elves to become reliable soldiers in the upcoming battles. Likewise, Toyohisa teaches inexperienced elves how to fight using a sword. However, the elves didn't seem very good at using the sword in close combat, as they were more skilled at archery. In the evening, Toyohisa and the drifters sense a threat approaching them. At the same time, two of the Ents, John Dark and Jules de Rise, and a Black King's army cavalry were heading to their hideout. This anime continues with Toyohisa and his comrades resting in their hideout after a long day of training the elves in fighting techniques and weapons skills. Not long after, they sensed a threat approaching them. At the same time, two of the Ents, John Dark and Jill's Rise, and a Black King's army cavalry were heading to their hideout. Arriving there, John and Jill's massively massacred the elves, who were completely unprepared for the sudden attack. They deliberately did that to provoke the appearance of Toyohisa and the drifters. Not long after, Toyohisa appeared and approached John without fear. Meanwhile, Nobunaga and Shara were seen evacuating the elven women and children to a safer place. He asked Shara to gather the male elves and told them to prepare because they would soon be fighting against the enemy cavalry. However, Yoichi doesn't seem to agree with his plan to pit the inexperienced elves' strength against the much more trained Black King's army. Even so, Nobunaga tried to convince Yoichi that he had a good reputation for destroying enemy cavalry. Hearing his words, the doubts in Yoichi's heart finally disappeared because he was very sure that Nobunaga was not joking, and he decided to entrust the war strategy to the leader of the Oda clan. Knowing that Yoichi was a drifter, Jills attacked him. Even though Yoichi managed to dodge the attack, he did not deny that Jills was a formidable warrior with strength that could not be underestimated, so Yoichi realized that this battle would not be easy for him to win. At the same time, Toyohisa looks overwhelmed by John, who has the power to manipulate fire. He found it difficult to approach and attack her because of her power. Unlike the drifters, who can only rely on their knowledge and physical strength during their lifetime, the Ents were awarded magical powers when sent to the world, so they became difficult to beat. Knowing that Almanu has magical power, Toyohisa asks her to help him defeat John. Although John has very terrible firepower, he feels confident that they will be able to defeat her because she is actually just an amateur on the battlefield. Hearing his words, Almanu once again admired him for being able to think of various possibilities to defeat the enemy in such a short time. Instead of being afraid of an opponent with terrible power, Toyohisa is confident in saying he will win the fight against John quite easily. Meanwhile, Yoichi, involved in a fierce battle against Jills, seemed overwhelmed because of the large difference in their strength. Even so, Yoichi could still match Jills and launch an attack on the vital point in the man's body. But gradually, Yoichi began to feel hopeless because all his attacks seemed useless to Jills, even though he had launched a deadly attack that even the strongest enemy could not dodge. In the forest, Nobunaga and the elves were already in their positions to attack the enemy cavalry troops about to head into battle. With the archery abilities the elves possessed, they could finally overthrow the enemy cavalry troops quite easily, thanks to Nobunaga's directives and precise strategy. Even though they had defeated the army, Nobunaga and the elves did not feel relieved because there were still two Ents that had to be killed before the madness of the Ents claimed many innocent lives. Switching back to Toyohisa's fight against John, he asked Almanu to create a barrier between himself and John. He planned to use the wall as a leap to attack John directly, and what impressed Almanu even more was that Toyohisa had figured it all out. With one swift movement, he lunged forward at John and threw her body into the well that was near them. Because the well was filled with water, she could not use her firepower. John was sinking to the bottom of the well and was reminded of her past. She was put on trial for heresy in Rouen on January 9, 1431. She was accused of being blasphemed by wearing men's clothes, acting upon demonic visions, and refusing to submit her words and deeds to the church because she claimed she would be judged by God alone. At the end of her life, John was then visited by Easy, who recruited her to become one of the Ents and sent her to that world while giving John the magic power to manipulate fire. Turning to the present, John finally woke up from her daydream when Toyohisa tried to lift her body from the well. He had intended to kill her, but after knowing that she was a woman, he gave up his intention because he had the principle not to hurt women, even though she was his enemy. Toyohisa told John to leave and never return to the battlefield to fight him because violent battles are not the right place for a woman. However, she didn't seem to care about his words and instead tried to attack him, so he was forced to knock her unconscious. In the meantime, Yoichi is still involved in a fierce battle with Jills. Yoichi seems increasingly overwhelmed because, as an ordinary human, his energy is starting to drain and is different from Jills's. He was awarded incredible strength and durability by Easy when he was sent to that world. Nobunaga and the elves, who finally arrived, tried to help Yoichi by repeatedly shooting arrows at Jills. However, even with the attacks they did simultaneously, Jills still could not be overthrown, so the elves began to become desperate and assumed that Jills was an immortal monster. Despite witnessing how well Jills withstood all their attacks, Nobunaga refused to believe that Jills was an immortal monster. Nobunaga believes there must be a way to defeat him, who has very strong physical strength. When he was thinking of a way to overthrow Jills, a group of people suddenly appeared and fired consecutive shots at Jills. They turned out to be Seimei and his comrades, who finally arrived at that place after traveling quite a distance from the kingdom of Carneades. At the same time, Jill's body, immune to attacks from Yoichi and the elves, instantly lost its resilience and slowly disintegrated into several pieces. Dying from being hit by a machine gun indiscriminately, Jills looked up at the sky and saw that a dragon had managed to save the unconscious John. Shortly afterward, his body turned into a lump of salt until it finally disappeared. After the battle, Seimei met Nobunaga and the others and introduced himself as Abe no Haruakira, better known as Abe no Seimei. Seimei said that he was the leader of the Octobrist organization, who assigned him to watch over the drifters. On the other hand, Yoichi looked very surprised when he heard the voice of a familiar man talking to him. That man was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a ruthless general of the Minamoto clan and Yoichi's former commander. Minamoto then warns him that soon they will meet on the battlefield as opponents in that world. Not long after, Toyohisa finally arrived at that place, where he met Seimei, who revealed that he was a drifter sent to that world by a mysterious man with glasses he met in a hallway with many doors. After finally arriving in that world, Seimei realized that his job was to fight the Ends and the Black King. Toyohisa told them he had just knocked John out and let her go. Upon hearing that, Seimei and Almanu suddenly felt shocked because the drifters should have ended the End's life without considering anything. However, Toyohisa remained firm in his stance that he would not hurt women even if they were opponents. Seimei realized that he would not be able to persuade Toyohisa to follow the rules they had believed in all along, so he decided to let it be, even though Toyohisa's life principles could sometimes harm them while on the battlefield. Almanu then asked about an old man who had come with Seimei, to which he explained that the old man was a drifter named Hannibal Barca, a great military commander of his time. Furthermore, Seimei informed them that there was one more drifter with them, namely Hannibal's adversary, Scipio Africanus. However, on the way, they are attacked by the Black King's army, causing Scipio to fall from the carriage and be forced to abandon him. The scene then switches and shows Scipio walking through the wilderness while trying to find the whereabouts of Hannibal and the others by following the trail of shoes on the ground. However, the trail instead led Scipio to Naoshi's fighter plane. Not long after, Naoshi arrived with a tribe of anthropomorphic dogs who worshipped him because they thought he was a god who came down from the sky after he landed his plane in the forest. Seeing Naoshi, who is a human, Scipio then tries to explain that he is not an enemy and just wants to find the whereabouts of a group of people. However, due to the language difference between the two, Naoshi and Scipio misunderstand each other. Elsewhere, Nobunaga, who seemed impressed with Sunden's kid's Gatling gun, asked how the rifle worked. After receiving information about the Gatling gun, he thought they should produce this weapon and a large amount of ammunition. He firmly believed their chances of winning the battle against the Black King's army would be greater. Upon hearing that, Seimei informed him they had previously tried to fight the Black King's army with that weapon, but it was not very effective. Even so, Nobunaga remained optimistic because he had previously prepared gunpowder, which became an important part of ammunition. As for manufacturing machine guns, he will entrust it completely to the dwarves, the best blacksmiths in the world. Seeing his way of thinking and optimism, Seimei felt they had to monitor Nobunaga's every move in the future because it would be a dangerous threat if he was on the enemy side. Not only that, Seimei realized that he and the members of the Octobrist would have a hard time if they wanted to unite the drifters with the same goal. This is because the drifters have their own life principles and ways of thinking that sometimes contradict each other. On the other side, the Ends have the same principles and goals as the Black King, so they are easier to put together and direct to reach their goals faster. After that, Seimei then asked Nobunaga about their next plan. He informed that he and his troops would attack the other military bases of the Orde Empire to free the dwarves, then invite them to form an alliance and form a great power that would overthrow the Orde Empire's power. Furthermore, Nobunaga informs that he plans to establish a multiracial federation, and Toyohisa will be appointed supreme leader. Seimei, who did not agree with the idea, then told Nobunaga that the federation had the potential to create a power struggle. But he seemed to ignore Seimei's words and argued that the multiracial federation would improve all races' lives. Seimei asked Nobunaga why he handed over the reins of leadership to Toyohisa, not himself, who took the lead. Nobunaga then revealed that he felt he had failed in carrying out his duties as a leader because when he was still the leader of the Oda clan, he was betrayed by members of his own clan. However, he saw Toyohisa fulfill all the qualifications needed to be a good leader, and Nobunaga took on the role of a loyal assistant who accompanied him. Meanwhile, Toyohisa approaches Hannibal, who looks gloomy and tries to communicate with him. However, Hannibal babbled incoherently, so Toyohisa tested him by trying to attack the old man. Surprisingly, he could stop Toyohisa's attack with just a stick he was holding. Even though Hannibal was just a senile old man, Toyohisa could surely tell that Hannibal still had excellent eyesight and skills. Before leaving, Toyohisa then asked Almanu to take good care of Hannibal. That night, he informs the elves that he will attack the other military bases of the Orde Empire to free the dwarves. Hearing that, the elves were immediately surprised because, in fact, the elves had long been in conflict with the dwarves. the elves insisted that they and the dwarves would never get along. Hearing that, Toyohisa said he would not force his will on the elves because he felt sure that the true warriors would continue to fight alongside him to bring about peace and prosperity that was equal for all. Having expressed his wish, Toyohisa left the place and headed towards the Orde Empire's military base alone. Seeing his departure, Shara and his people finally decided to be with Toyohisa. After all, they had saved them from the cruelty of the nobles of the Orde Empire. Shara also emphasized to the elves that they must put aside their respective egos and form an alliance with the dwarves at a critical time like this. If they unite, they can tear down the empire and bring world peace. Meanwhile, on the way, Toyohisa accidentally meets Seimei and the drifters. They are planning to return to their base to monitor the movement of the Ends as well as find Scipio's whereabouts. At the same time, Nobunaga and Yoichi finally arrived, as did the elves, who decided to fight alongside Toyohisa. Meanwhile, Saint Jeremy plans to meet him and the drifters to strike a deal. On the way, Saint Jeremy and his assistants were discussing the Orde Empire's armory located in Gadalka, which was also the place where they held the dwarves. Saint Jeremy assumed that the drifters and the elves would attack and attempt to take over the place, and if that happened, they could no longer do anything to prevent the Orde Empire's destruction. Long story short, Toyohisa and the elves finally arrived at Gadalka and immediately launched a surprise attack, according to Saint Jeremy's predictions. When the soldiers of the Orde Empire were overwhelmed by the bomb attack, Toyohisa led the elves to break through the base's defenses and repeatedly attack, making the soldiers even more desperate. Meanwhile, Yoichi, who was in charge of securing the watchtower in Gadalka, managed to complete his task very well, thanks to his archery skills. Under attack from all sides, the soldiers of the Orde Empire became completely motionless, and they could not escape because they were surrounded by the enemy. Not long after, the elite force of the Orde Empire was finally deployed to the battlefield. Seeing the appearance of the elite troops, Toyohisa asked the elves to retreat while he would remain there with Almanu. He again asked her to help him with her magical power, where she then surrounded the Orde Empire's elite troops with a stone wall. After they were surrounded, he ordered the elves to shower them with bombs, instantly killing the elite soldiers without having time to fight back. The soldiers of the Orde Empire who witnessed how Toyohisa overthrew the elite troops without any effort became increasingly panicked and frightened because he not only had a very formidable fighting power, but also had intelligence in managing war strategies. The soldiers then closed the main gate so Toyohisa and his army could not enter Gadalka city. But their efforts were in vain because Nobunaga had anticipated this, and then asked Almanu to use her magical power combined with Yoichi's arrows to create stairs, so that Toyohisa and his army could climb the stone wall and penetrate the defenses at the gate. After successfully passing through the main gate, Toyohisa and the elves immediately split up to find the location of the dwarves who were supposed to be held there. They finally found where the dwarves were being held, where he looked surprised because the appearance of the dwarves he met in person was completely different from the image of the elves who said that the dwarves were horrifying creatures. In fact, the dwarves did not show any hostility towards the elves, and they were very grateful that Toyohisa and the elves had freed them from the Orde Empire's cruelty. Seeing the dwarves' cooperative attitude, Shara and the elves finally realized how important it was to unite forces to face a common enemy. After that, Toyohisa asked Shara and the elves to find a food warehouse and prepare food for the dwarves because Toyohisa would not continue the war if the soldiers starved. They held a banquet in front of the second gate, where he then asked the soldiers of the Orde Empire who were guarding there to surrender and promise not to take their lives. Toyohisa welcomed the decision of the soldiers of the Orde Empire. However, according to tradition in his home country, a commander who surrenders must end his own life to make amends for failing to achieve victory. Upon hearing that, the commander refused to end his life and begged him to spare his life. However, Toyohisa is a person who always adheres to the principles of his life, so he immediately intervenes to kill the commander's life and fulfills his promise to keep the other soldiers alive. Meanwhile, when Yoichi prepares to pursue the fleeing troops, a habit he developed when serving Minamoto in the past, Toyohisa stops him and tells him that he does not have to follow dishonorable orders anymore since this is their war, much to Yoichi's delight. Meanwhile, two members of the Octobrist who were monitoring the movement of the Black King and his army saw the Bronze Dragon, one of the 6 great dragons who seemed to have allied themselves with the Black King. Not only that, but they also found a herd of monsters who were cultivating like humans and assumed that the Black King was not actually planning to destroy the world but to destroy human civilization. The next day, Saint Jeremy and his assistants finally arrived at the Drifters' headquarters and met a man named Mills, who had been rescued by Nobunaga. Mills, a government employee in the Orde Empire, immediately welcomed Saint Jeremy's arrival and asked the purpose of his arrival at the headquarters of the Drifters, who were his enemy. Saint Jeremy said that he wanted to meet the Drifters. Hearing this, Mills informed that the Drifters and the Elven army were going to Gadalka to free the dwarves and ally with them. Saint Jeremy seemed surprised to learn that the drifters had actually gone to Gadalka as he had expected, which would indicate that the destruction of the Orde Empire was imminent. That's why he decided to wait for the drifters to return to the base until they returned from Gadalka. In the meantime, the Bronze Dragon came to the Black King not to ally with him but to express his displeasure that the Black King had presumptuously taken over the herd of the winged dragons who were actually the Bronze Dragon's men. However, the Black King did not heed the dragon's bluff and offered the Bronze Dragon as his subordinate. Hearing this, the Bronze Dragon suddenly felt angry because, indirectly, the Black King had despised the great dragons. The Bronze Dragon prepared to launch an attack on the Black King, but he was no match for the Black King, who could easily subdue the dragon. After being defeated by the Black King, the dragon begged for mercy and was finally willing to become his subordinate. Although the Black King seems to have tremendous power, as if it can multiply anything, including food ingredients, it is not an immortal being. Therefore, the Black King needs the help of the Ents to achieve his goal of creating a world without human civilization. On the other hand, John, who had just woken up from her stupor, was shocked and devastated when she learned that Gilles de Rise had been defeated by the drifters. Because of that, her ambition is to take revenge on Toyohisa and the drifters. Anastasia warns her not to underestimate the drifters because they don't know how powerful they are. Anastasia promises that she will help John to take her revenge on the drifters and asks her to rest so she can recover quickly. After that, Anastasia goes to Rasputin and discusses Toyohisa, which they think they should watch out for because he often acts out of bounds, and his thoughts are also very unpredictable. The scene then switches and shows Nobunaga explaining to the dwarves about the firearms that are planned to be mass-produced. With Nobunaga's detailed explanation, the dwarves finally understood the design and function of the weapon even though they had never seen it before and were able to manufacture it in just one day, with even better quality. Meanwhile, Toyohisa, training a group of dwarves on how to fight and use weapons, was suddenly surprised by the appearance of two Saint Jeremy assistants, Alesta and Flame. At the same time, Nobunaga was also very surprised by the arrival of Saint Jeremy, one of the most respected rulers in the Orde Empire. But more surprisingly, Saint Jeremy revealed that he was a drifter, as was Adolf Hitler, the founder of the Orde Empire. However, Nobunaga and Yoichi did not relax their guard, as Saint Jeremy looked suspicious. Saint Jeremy then stated his purpose in coming there, which turned out to be wanting to volunteer as an ally of the drifters in the fight against the Orde Empire. Turns back to Toyohisa, who happily accepts the challenge from Alesta and Flame to fight with them. However, he didn't need to bother exerting his strength because they admitted defeat just like that after meeting Hannibal and Yoichi. They had their own charisma to conquer their hearts. They only intended to test the drifters' abilities to ensure they were formidable and reliable allies. Not long after, Alesta was seen entering the city of Verlina, the capital of the Orde Empire. At first, the soldiers guarding the city gates prevented the man from entering because of his suspicious movements. However, after Alesta informed that the horse-drawn carriage that accompanied her was the war aid sent by Saint Jeremy, the faces of the soldiers looked happy because they were indeed experiencing a downturn and shortage of soldiers as a result of the ongoing war. In fact, the ones in the carriage were the drifters, the elves, and the dwarves, who were planning to launch a surprise attack on the capital that day. When they finally entered the city, Toyohisa and the others saw that the atmosphere of the capital was very concerning because the citizens lived in misery, which indirectly proves that the government officials of the Orde Empire only cared about power and were busy enriching themselves, while the commoners are left to suffer in poverty. Perhaps Saint Jeremy decided to ally with the drifters to stage a coup against the Orde Empire. He holds a meeting with the nobles of the Orde Empire, where he openly reveals that he is a drifter and plans to dissolve the Orde Empire's government, which is on the verge of collapse. Furthermore, Saint Jeremy said that the power over the Orde Empire would be taken over by Toyohisa as the supreme leader. Suddenly the nobles were very surprised to learn that they had to give up their power to the drifters, their enemies. The nobles opposed his decision and ordered the soldiers to arrest him. But at the same time, Toyohisa and his comrades have defeated the soldiers who guard the place, so they also have no choice but to comply with Saint Jeremy's wish to surrender full power to them. However, Rasputin, who has the same magical power as the Octobrist, can use his magic to possess other people from a distance, as he showed when one of the nobles met with Saint Jeremy. Rasputin warns Saint Jeremy that the drifters will not be able to take on the Black King and his army and looks down on Toyohisa and his comrades who were just at the scene. Rasputin told them that the Black King's army had actually infiltrated the city of Verlina and was just waiting for orders to carry out an attack. On the other hand, Toyohisa was very irritated because Rasputin humiliated himself and his troops, then slaughtered the enemy in front of him, making Rasputin shudder to see Toyohisa's brutal way of fighting. Toyohisa and Nobunaga did not waste the opportunity to verbally intimidate Rasputin so that he would become frightened and no longer look down on them. Rasputin, irritated by Nobunaga's actions, then finished his magic and reported to the Black King that the drifters had succeeded in seizing the power of the Orde Empire. Although Rasputin looked very worried because things didn't go according to plan, the Black King didn't mind it because they couldn't predict everything accurately. However, the Black King then asked Rasputin and Hijikata to continue their plan to control the city of Verlina and take over the power of the Orde Empire. If they fail to carry out the plan, the next step is to burn down the city so that no one, including the drifters, can occupy it and make it their base of defense. Meanwhile, Nobunaga had not actually set up a strategy against the Black King and his army because their plan was originally to take over the power of the Orde Empire from the nobles. Saint Jeremy told Nobunaga that he had prepared 500 formidable fighters nicknamed the Sacred Band of Thebes to strengthen their army. Nobunaga thought quickly and then devised a strategy by placing the Sacred Band of Thebes under his command and arming them with firearms that the dwarves had made. Toyohisa, who can fight at close range, is assigned to lead the dwarves on the battlefield, while Yoichi and the elves, who have archery skills, are assigned as reconnaissance troops and launch attacks from a distance. With this strategy, Toyohisa and the drifters are confident they can win the battle against the Black King's army. Moreover, they also benefited from the Octobrist's long-distance communication tool that could allow them to communicate with each other. They left it entirely to Almanu, who served as an informant. Rasputin and Hijikata and the Black King's army finally arrived at the city of Verlina and launched an attack. However, the attack was blocked by Nobunaga and the Sacred Band of Thebes, who then counterattacked by shooting at them. After that, Nobunaga asked Almanu to inform Yoichi to prepare for a ranged attack while they would pave the way for Toyohisa and the dwarves to attack Hijikata, the army leader. While Murasaki seemed amazed by the war strategy of Toyohisa and the drifters that he sent, it was not the case with Hijikata, who seemed so furious that the drifters had managed to scatter his troops in the front row. Hijikata, who had studied the tactics used by the drifters, then ordered his troops to spread out and move in small groups so that they would not be easily targeted by Nobunaga's team, while Hijikata would face Toyohisa head-on. Seeing the enemy's movement change, Toyohisa and Nobunaga wondered about what really happened. Yoichi informed them that the enemy was moving in small groups and had spread throughout the city. In addition, they deliberately set fire to people's houses to limit visibility so that the archer and shooter teams could not carry out attacks. After hearing this, Nobunaga felt anxious and assumed that the current army leader was not an ordinary person but someone smart enough to guess their strategy and devise tactics to match it. On the other hand, Hijikata finally appeared before Toyohisa and immediately drew his sword, preparing to attack him. Hijikata, who turns out to be holding a grudge against the Shimazu clan, intends to take revenge on Toyohisa, who is part of the Shimazu clan. When he was involved in a fierce battle against Hijikata, Nobunaga and Yoichi then rushed to the government building where Almanu was because the enemy troops were trying to occupy the place to gather strength. Meanwhile, Toyohisa deliberately provoked Hijikata's anger to make him furious. Full of anger, Hijikata indiscriminately attacked him, breaking his sword. However, Toyohisa didn't seem afraid, even though his whole body was covered in wounds from Hijikata's sword slashes. In the middle of the fight, a loud explosion suddenly startled them both. The explosion turned out to be from Yoichi attacking the Black King's army, who gathered in one place after he and the others had set a trap to trap them there. Meanwhile, Nobunaga and his troops managed to corner the enemy troops who tried to occupy the government building and massacred them all. At the same time, Hijikata finally realized that Toyohisa was just a diversion to keep himself busy while Nobunaga and the others massacred his entire army. Hijikata, who was getting increasingly furious, attacked Toyohisa repeatedly. However, he managed to withstand the attack and gave quite a fierce resistance until finally, the Black King asked Hijikata to retreat in the middle of the fight. At first, Hijikata was reluctant to end his fight with Toyohisa, who was starting to run out of energy. But then, he finally obeyed his master's orders and left the fight in defeat, while Toyohisa collapsed unconscious due to severe injuries all over his body. Rasputin and Hijikata then apologized to the Black King because they had lost against the drifters. However, the Black King didn't mind because the battle aimed only to test the enemy's strength and learn their strategies. In addition, the Black King felt confident they would win the battle with the help of Akechi Mitsuhide, who was Nobunaga's rival. Although the drifters managed to defeat the troops led by Hijikata, the war badly damaged the city of Verlina. After a fierce battle against Hijikata, Toyohisa still hasn't regained consciousness due to his severe injuries. When Yoichi stitches Toyohisa's wound, he is reminded of his first meeting with Toyohisa, who was seriously injured in the Battle of Sekigahara. Seeing Toyohisa's body covered in scars, Yoichi thought he was a true fighter, so he was not surprised by his stubborn and always death-defying attitude. Nobunaga, who heard this, agreed with Yoichi and said that people like Toyohisa will not stop until he gets what he wants, even if life is at stake. Saint Jeremy then asked Nobunaga about their next move. Nobunaga said that they must form alliances with other kingdoms. If they refused, he would not hesitate to wage war on any party who refused to form an alliance. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a member of the Octobrist named Doug and one of his colleagues assigned to oversee the movement of the Black King and his army in the Carnides fortress decided to infiltrate the base by disguised as soldiers of the Black King. When they finally entered the place, they were surprised to find out that the monsters and the demi-human races had implemented a human-like life system, such as opening a market as a trading center. In fact, they also made humans slaves and freely traded humans like livestock for meat consumption. Doug and his comrade also wondered about what the Black King had done to make the monsters have a civilization like humans in a short time. However, their disguise was discovered by Minamoto, who then told them that what they had just seen was only a small part of the power possessed by the Black King's army. Doug and his comrade try to fight him, but they are not worthy opponents for him, one of the ends. He can easily defeat Doug and kills him brutally. Minamoto told Doug's comrade that the thing the drifters had to fear was the monsters who decided to join the Black King's army. Hearing this, the member of the Octobrist was suddenly shocked because all this time, the monsters were known as a race that always fought each other. He shuddered, knowing that the monsters had worked together to form a very powerful force. With pride, Minamoto said that all these achievements, none other than because of the greatness of the Black King. At the same time, the Black King appeared before the two of them and, surprisingly, asked Seimei to reveal himself immediately. The Black King apparently knew that Seimei had been hiding behind his men all this time. Having been found out, Seimei suddenly appeared in front of them miraculously. They debated the differences in views between the two of them regarding creatures called humans. The Black King assumes humans are just creatures who always make mischief worldwide. However, Seimei disagreed with the Black King because, according to him, all races, including humans and monsters, had the potential to cause damage wherever they were, especially if they had an arrogant and greedy nature. It didn't stop there. The Black King added that the drifters would only exacerbate the situation because they deliberately taught the elves and the dwarves about technology that could worsen the damage, such as firearms and explosives. Upon hearing that, Seimei didn't necessarily take the Black King's opinion for granted because humans and monsters, or other races, can cause chaos and destruction in the future, so destroying human civilization is not the solution to this problem. Before leaving there, Seimei told the Black King that humanity would never give up. Likewise, the drifters will fight the Black King and his army to the end. Meanwhile, after several days of unconsciousness elsewhere, Toyohisa finally woke up with bandages covering almost his entire body. Yoichi asked him not to push himself too hard in the next battle because even though he has physical strength that exceeds human, he is still an ordinary human who can be seriously injured and even lose his life. However, as usual, Toyohisa didn't care about Yoichi's words because, according to the principle of his life, he would put all his strength into fighting against the enemy and would not stop before defeating his enemies. Even Toyohisa had prepared himself if he had to lose his life in battle. Yoichi doesn't mind Toyohisa's principle of life, which according to him, is the principle of a true warrior. However, what worries him is that if Toyohisa dies on the battlefield, no one will be able to rekindle the soldiers' fighting spirit and lead the troops valiantly. In addition, Yoichi did not deny that Toyohisa's existence had made him and Nobunaga excited to defeat the enemies on the battlefield. The scene then switches and shows Nobunaga meeting with the Orde Empire's nobles, where Nobunaga openly asks the nobles to donate their wealth to finance the war against the Black King. Not only that, but Nobunaga also asked Saint Germain to form an alliance with the merchant guild Gubinin because they have a very formidable naval fleet, and it has been proven by their success in winning the battle against the Orde Empire troops some time ago. Furthermore, Nobunaga plans to strengthen their army by recruiting the Orde Empire's elite troops, divided into 4 groups. Because the First Army has joined their army, he also plans to recruit elite soldiers in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Army. They spread throughout the Orde Empire because they must overcome the region's rebellions. Soon afterward, Saint Germain told Nobunaga that there was no need to put too much hope in the 2nd Army because they seemed to have been defeated by a swarm of beasts that had attacked them in the middle of the forest. Therefore, they should be paying attention to the 3rd and the 4th Army right now. After that, because all the nobles of the Orde Empire had gathered, Nobunaga planned to introduce Toyohisa as the ruler of the Orde Empire and the person who would lead them on the battlefield. However, Toyohisa instead acted ridiculous while desperately looking for food. Hence, the nobles became unsure of the figure of their new leader, who was said to be very violent on the battlefield. Meanwhile, 500 miles from the Orde Empire lies Gubinin, a nation ruled by 7 guilds and led by the secretary of the Shylock Bank and Trading House, Banzelmesh and Shylock VIII. That day, Shylock and his right hand, Nasal Brigante, were meeting with a drifter named Tamon Yamaguchi, an admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II who had helped Gubinin defeat the Orde Empire. Shylock asked Admiral Tamon to join Gubinin's navy because it was Admiral Tamon's direction and strategy that enabled them to win the battle against the Orde Empire. With him joining their army, Shylock feels confident that their navy will be increasingly invincible. Admiral Tamon agreed with Shylock's request and asked about their next move. Shylock explains that they will only defend their territory in the sea because Gu Binin's troops become invincible if they fight in the sea, in contrast to the Orde Empire's troops, who control the land. Furthermore, Shylock revealed that he was never interested in seizing the territories of other kingdoms, including the Orde Empire, because it was not profitable for them. After all, the Orde Empire did not have the resources they needed or could make a profit. Moreover, the Orde Empire is also experiencing a crisis due to rebellions happening everywhere, so what Gu Binin needs to do right now is wait for the Orde Empire's power to collapse. Hearing this, Admiral Tamon then praised Shylock's thinking, which he considered quite clever and not rash. However, Admiral Tamon then said that for now, he is not interested in joining the Gu Binin fleet, even though Shylock has offered many luxurious facilities and considerable wealth. Admiral Tamon apparently remained steadfast in his stance, so even Shylock could do nothing but respect his decision. Even so, Shylock was sure that Admiral Tamon would join them sooner or later, so he didn't change his mind about recruiting the Admiral into Gu Binin's fleet. Admiral Tamon's refusal was not without reason. He still wanted to make sure that Gu Binin was a side worth fighting for and not an enemy who was oppressing the weak and powerless. Elsewhere, Toyohisa enlists the help of the dwarves to repair the sword that was broken during the battle against Hijikata. However, upon seeing the sword, the dwarves said that Toyohisa's sword forging technique was too complex, and they had never seen such a good technique. However, the dwarves said they would try to repair Toyohisa's sword and learn the complex forging technique. Meanwhile, Nobunaga, who was messing around with the 3rd and 4th armies and was reluctant to ally with them, then devised a plan to pit the leaders of the two armies against each other because he firmly believed that the leaders of these troops must be very easily persuaded by the lure of power over the territory of the Orde Empire. Long story short, Nobunaga sent a letter to the 3rd and 4th Army's army leaders stating that the Orde Empire's capital had been conquered and the nobles had been massacred by the enemy. Therefore, the Orde Empire now needs the figure of a new leader who could bring about better changes in the Orde Empire and restore its former glory. Nobunaga's plan turned out to be a success because the leaders of the elite troops raced to the city of Verlina to claim power over the Orde Empire, until finally, the leader of the 4th Army, General Lemek, was killed in the battle against the 3rd Army when they were about to head for the army to the city of Verlina. Meanwhile, Yoichi is assigned to kill General Jigmente, the 3rd Army's leader. Shortly afterward, Nobunaga ordered the elves to disguise themselves as troops of the 4th Army to imply that their leader had been killed by the 4th Army. After dealing with the 3rd and 4th Armies, Nobunaga sent a letter to the other nations and kingdoms they had been fighting and proposed a true truce. Hearing the plan, Saint Jeremy seemed pessimistic because the Orde Empire's war against other nations had been going on for years, so they would definitely find it difficult to accept the ceasefire option, especially now that they knew that the Orde Empire was experiencing a power crisis. Nobunaga and Saint Jeremy's debate became increasingly fierce, especially after Nobunaga suddenly stated that he planned to massacre the soldiers of the 3rd and 4th Armies, while Saint Jeremy still insisted on taking over the troops to strengthen their troops in the war against the Black King and his army. Saint Jeremy thought so because compared to the Black King's army, their troop numbers were still very far apart, so increasing the number of troops would be much more profitable. Nobunaga did not deny that his ideas were quite good and benefited them. But Nobunaga thought they would find it difficult to unite the two elite armies who were already hostile to each other, so slaughtering them would be much easier. Moreover, Nobunaga feels that the two armies will bring trouble to the drifters if they are left alive. When he and Saint Jeremy were developing war strategies and future diplomatic plans, Toyohisa was seen relaxing with Hannibal Barca, even though Toyohisa was their supreme leader who should also be involved in managing everything. Seeing this, Almanu then asked Toyohisa why he was even relaxing when the other drifters were planning strategies. He replied that he was not the type of person like Nobunaga, who was good at strategizing and conducting diplomacy to secure their power. Toyohisa says that the only thing he knows about war is to keep fighting until the last drop of blood. He emphasized that he didn't mind if he had to die while fighting because dying on the battlefield was an honor for a warrior like himself. The scene then switches and shows Seimei and the drifters meeting Admiral Tamon and inviting him to join their alliance. Meanwhile, Saint Jeremy rushes to Gu Binin after Shylock responds to Nobunaga's request for a ceasefire. Shylock then asks the Orde Empire to send representatives so that they can discuss further the options for peace between the two sides. Even Saint Jeremy assumed that negotiations with Gu Binin wouldn't be easy. However, he would try to reach the agreement he and Nobunaga hoped for and form an alliance with Gu Binin. Saint Jeremy then reveals to Shylock that the Orde Empire needs their help to supply food and some money. Furthermore, he showed Shylock his firearm and ammunition and said they would arm Gu Binin's troops with these weapons, but they needed money to produce them on a large scale. In addition, Saint Jeremy explained about the Black King and his army, who planned to destroy mankind and create a new world without human civilization. After listening to all of St. Jeremy's presentations, Shylock immediately agreed to his request to supply the Orde Empire with food and money, indicating that Gubinin was willing to form an alliance with the Orde Empire to face the Black King and his army, which threatens their safety. Elsewhere, the anthropomorphic dogs tribe appears to be in a heated argument with the anthropomorphic cat tribe, even though they previously allied themselves to defeat the elite forces of the Orde Empire. Naoshi, considered a sky god by the anthropomorphic animal tribes, intervened and managed to quell the dispute until Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid finally arrived to deliver a letter from Admiral Tamon. Naoshi, who knows Admiral Tamon because both are Japanese soldiers who fought in World War II, seems surprised to learn that he is also in that world and asks Naoshi to join him and the Drifters in fighting the Black King. Sundance Kid then told Naoshi and Scipio that the Black King and his army had moved to the south to start the battle, so they didn't have much time and had to hurry to strategize and prepare all the things needed in battle. At the same time, Seimei immediately dispatched members of the Octobris to spread out in all directions and warned other kingdoms in the south and surrounding areas to prepare themselves for the attack of the Black King and his army, which was expected to arrive in the next few days. The following day, the Black King seems to have prepared his army of monsters and the demi-human races divided into several groups and under the command of the Ents. While Akechi Mitsuhide was ordered to lead the army of centaurs, Hijikata would lead the troops in the vanguard and pave the way for the main army led by the Black King. Meanwhile, Anastasia will lead the troops in the rear. In this battle, Rasputin is assigned to spy on the movements of the Drifters. Before heading to the battlefield, the Black King ordered his troops to slaughter all humans and any race that defended humans and was on the enemy's side, including women, the elderly, and children. Long story short, the Black King and his army finally arrived at the kingdom closest to their base's border and immediately launched an attack indiscriminately. Even though Seimei and his men had warned the leader of the kingdom about the dire threat from the Black King and his army, they didn't seem to care and arrogantly boasted of their military might. The royal soldiers became overwhelmed when facing attacks from the Black King and his army. Not only did the kingdom fall apart, but Minamoto and his army also massacred the residents indiscriminately according to the orders of the Black King. Even John did not hesitate to use her power to burn the kingdom. Apart from the two, Hijikata also spread a terrible terror with his fighting power that could slay the enemy without touching him. After witnessing the massacre carried out by the Black King and his army, the remaining soldiers decided to flee. They warned the other kingdoms of the terrible fighting power possessed by the Black King and his army, so they had no choice but to form an alliance with the Drifters in the Orde Empire because they were the only hope they had to win the battle. After receiving a letter from Admiral Tamon, Naoshi rushed to meet him on his ship to ensure he was in that world. They engage in a conversation about World War II. Even though in that battle they have been defeated, in this battle they will fight with all their might to achieve victory. Naoshi showed the fighter plane and the firearms and ammunition he had to Admiral Tamon and Scipio, who were now allied with them. The first season ended with Scipio, who looked so amazed when he saw all these modern weapons and asked them both to tell the developments in the military world because he comes from the before Christ era, which indicates that the time gap between them is thousands of years. This is the end of this anime. The moral that we can learn from this series is that humankind has the potential to cause damage on this earth, but what we have to do is not to destroy human civilization but to eliminate the selfish, arrogant, and greedy traits in each of us, as well as aware of the importance of protecting the environment from things that cause permanent damage.